are you saying that limerence, I mean, the individuals who are experiencing limerence, they use, this superpower to soothe, numb, cope, and regulate themselves? Are you saying that?
Yeah. So I think a lot of people, and this can even be that trap of where you don't take action on kind of romantic connection, romantic desire, because whilst it's still in your head as a fantasy, you can tap into it any time that you want, and you can get that kind of second-hand excitement of imagining what it would be like to be with them, and that makes you feel high, and it's risk-free because it's all safely in your mind and in your imagination, and people can end up actually realizing that they've trapped themselves.
Hey everyone, I hope everyone is doing good and taking good care of themselves. So today I'm joined by Dr. Tom Bellamy, a neuroscientist, writer, and academic. Dr. Bellamy earned his PhD in neuroscience from University College London and has led groundbreaking research at the Medical Research Council, the Babraham Institute, and now the University of Nottingham. Alongside, publishing extensively on brain, physiology, he's also founder of the Living With Limerence, a resource born out of both scientific expertise and his personal journey through limerence. His work uniquely bridges neuroscience and the lived experience, offering practical ways to understand, manage, and ultimately master this powerful emotional state. So without any delay, let me welcome Dr. Tom Bellamy. Thank you so much, Dr. Tom, for joining in today.
Hello, it's my pleasure.
And viewers, I would request you all to check out, wonderful books that Tom has written on this topic and subject, and other topics also on Amazon. And he goes by the name Dr. L. And I didn't know until and unless one day I bumped across his channel, and it was out. I was like, wow, I got hold of Dr. L. And I thought that maybe let me welcome Dr. L and let's chat on this topic. So Tom, if you could briefly tell me and your viewers, what are you currently working at? What are your goals? Where are you at professionally?
So at the moment, I am working full time on understanding limerence and writing about limerence, and learning more about both, as you put it, the lived experience, but also the sort of neuroscientific basis of the phenomenon. So I'm no longer actively an academic. I am now independent, but I still have an honorary position at the University of Nottingham. So I've still got a connection to my old world as an academic. But now I am 100% focused on trying to understand limerence more, trying to communicate about what it is, what it means, how to manage it, because it can be a very disruptive force in life. And so I suppose the major part of my work is helping people to understand what's going on in their brains when they're in that limerence state, and then develop strategies for getting out of it if it's unwanted, if they can't form a relationship with the person that they're limerent for, how to manage that and how to move forwards to a more purposeful life.
Tom, I often explain, to my clients and to my friends and, to my colleagues that limerence isn't just psychological. It's a kind of a chemical loop in the brain. And of course, thanks to your work and, there are others and Dorothy. Now, I would want to know, from your perspective, your experience, your research, could you walk us through the neuroscience of why limerence feels so addictive? And it feels impossible. It's very hard to break free from such a state. If you could just explain us.
Sure. So limerence, I think, is best described as an altered mental state, and about half the population experience it in the early stages of love. So I think of limerence as it was defined by Dorothy Tenoff, who originally coined the word and tried to kind of capture the idea in her book, Love and Limerence. And it's the experience of being in limerence is extraordinary. So it doesn't feel like everyday life. It feels as though you're almost in a different cognitive mode for your brain. And so it's characterized by emotional extremes. So the person that you're infatuated with, that you've become limerent for, so we tend to call that person the limerent object. And that's quite kind of deliberate word use by Dorothy Tenoff, because it captures that point that we are objectifying this person. We're projecting our own kind of romantic fantasies and our own romantic desires onto this other person, rather than seeing them as a kind of whole person with flaws and as a real human being. We do tend to, as limerents, objectify that person. They get raised into a state where they're kind of a romantic paragon. They're like the perfect partner. And that altered mental state includes things like feelings of euphoria. So you feel, high just from being around that person. Feelings of a very powerful connection. So limerents say, these ideas of true love or twin souls meeting, or, meeting your soulmate. Limerents will often report that, or this is the first time I've ever understood that, or I've ever felt that, because they feel that there's an extraordinary sense of connection to this other person, that there's something unusually attractive about them, that they really are special. And limerents also, whilst you get that euphoria and the exhilaration and the elation and the excitement and all of that romantic promise and potential, limerence also comes bundled in with some negative experiences. So things like real anxiety, if you think maybe your feelings aren't reciprocated, and you're if your limerent object behaves in a way that makes you feel like, oh, they don't like me, they're not interested in me, you'll get the opposite emotional swing into a sort of state of anxiety. Now, all of those phenomena are ultimately based in the brain. So we understand what euphoria is. We understand what intense desire is in terms of the brain. We understand what anxiety is. And we understand as well about that sense of connection to another person, and the feeling that they are uniquely special to you and more desirable than anybody else. And those are all normal functions of the brain. So there's kind of three systems in the brain that are particularly important in that the sensation of being limerent in the early stages. So the first is the arousal system. So that's all about the sort of excitement, the energy, the drive, the racing heart and sweaty palms, and that kind of autonomic response that you get when you're really excited. But it's also in terms of thoughts as well. So your thoughts race. You feel like you're thinking faster. And people talk about how, the whole world seems more colourful and vibrant and alive since I met this person. Mm-hmm. It really does feel like you're kind of transformed, because your brain is almost kind of in that heightened state of arousal, that heightened state of activity. So that system is kind of based around the neurotransmitter noradrenaline. The Americans call it norepinephrine. But that's what gives you that drive and that arousal and that excitement. The second brain system is the reward system, and that's based around dopamine. So that's probably much more commonly known in kind of popular society. And dopamine is that drive that makes you want things. So dopamine is often kind of portrayed as being the pleasure chemical, but that actually isn't right. So dopamine, it's a way of assessing reward. within the brain, within the reward system of the brain. So the actual feelings of euphoria and the feelings of pleasure they can be triggered by dopamine, but they're actually mediated within the brain by different neurotransmitters. Seems to be kind of endocannabinoids and opioids within the brain. And so you can get this very peculiar scenario in the brain, which is going to be, important later, where wanting is being driven by dopamine, but liking is separate. So you can like things that you didn't particularly want. If you're full and you're satiated and you're not hungry, still having a sugary drink is pleasurable, because the taste of sugar is pleasurable. So you can like things even if you don't want them, but even more importantly, you can want things after you've stopped liking them. So it's the peculiarity of the reward system that wanting can be kind of uncoupled from liking. And if you get trapped in a state where that wanting is really powerful and a kind of constant drive, it doesn't even matter anymore if you like the thing that you're wanting. So the reward system is the second system that's relevant. The third system that's relevant is the bonding system. And that's mediated by oxytocin and vasopressin. So those are actually hormones or neuropeptides that are released into the brain, and they regulate social reward and attachment. So being attached to another person, originally, of course, primarily attachment to a mother, and then as you go through life, attachments to other people, friends, and then romantic partners potentially in the future, that is being mediated by the bonding system within the brain. Now, limerence seems to be a state when those three systems are all firing at the same time, and the consequence is that one person becomes a very powerful natural reward. So you get a natural high from being around that person. And that's very good for forming a pair bond and mating. Mm-hmm. So from a kind of reproductive perspective, it's useful to have these systems built into our brain that will make us really powerfully want somebody that, our subconscious has recognized as, they could be a very valuable mate, or they're a very desirable mate. And so that makes you want that person and seek to bond with that person very powerfully. So that's all good. So far things are okay. And for many people experiencing that, myself included, you would just think, well, that's just love. All of those things that I've just described, the elation, the euphoria, the intense desire, the kind of thoughts constantly being on them, all of that people would describe as being, that's just love. But half of the population do not experience the state of limerence. So they are perfectly able to fall in love, perfectly able to form a pair bond, have a rewarding romantic relationship, have children, have a full life, but they don't get into that altered mental state. It, for them, doesn't feel as though their whole mind has been transformed, their whole world has been transformed by this enormous natural high that that limerence experience when they're in those kind of early stages of love. Where things go wrong, and where most of the people that I talk to on the blog are suffering, is that if you cannot form a healthy relationship with the person that you're limerent for, the limerence doesn't just go away, it progresses. And so it may be that that person is unavailable, it may be that they don't reciprocate your feelings, so it's unrequited. It may be that they are giving you mixed messages, and sometimes they seem as though they're interested, but other times they're not. Might be that you're not available because you're already committed to somebody else, and yet you've met a new person that's triggered limerence. So there's lots of obviously reasons why love might not be smooth in terms of the progression of events. But what happens with limerence is that natural high that you're getting can drive your reward system into a new state, a state of behavioral addiction. And so we know this from other behavioral addictions. So gambling is the best characterized, but there are other sort of things like gaming addictions and shopping addictions and love addiction and so on. Limerence, I think, late stage limerence is well described as addiction to another person. And so your reward system gets into a state where that wanting drive from dopamine has been reinforced so strongly that it feels irresistible. You've just got this insatiable wanting desire for the other person. At the same time, our executive brain, so the kind of the most evolutionary modern part of our brain that should be providing context to us, that should be helping us judge the value of a reward and the value of a desire and whether it's safe to act, that gets desensitized and that gets weakened. So you can end up in this state exactly like substance addictions, where you crave something with an irresistible wanting drive, but you don't feel able to control it. You don't feel able to exert willpower to stop seeking that source of reward relentlessly. And that is, in terms of the changes within the brain, and this is at the level of synapses, getting stronger or getting weaker, that is a state of addiction. So it's sometimes referred to as incentive sensitization. So one reward dominates everything, overwhelms everything. It's the only thing that you really care about. It's the most, powerful motivating force in your life. And that is what it feels like if you've got stuck in limerence for another person for too long, and you've sort of transitioned into this state of person addiction rather than the kind of euphoric, exciting fireworks excitement of the early stages of limerence. So hopefully that covers most of the territory on the neuroscience.
Tom, you talked about the chemical changes, chemical highs and lows, euphoria, and fizzing out, and you talked about a lot of things. I mean, the chemical aspect. Tom, I would like to know your views when it comes to trauma bonding, emotional abuse, and manipulation. Is there a possibility? I am not an expert. I've not delved more into it. But is there a possibility that these things also alter the brain chemical to an extent when you're manipulated, when love is withheld and given like crumbs? That also creates an addiction cycle, and there is some amount of research out there that says that yes, intermittent love and all of these things can create something quite similar to addiction, because cortisol is being flooded when it's being withheld, and all of a sudden attention is given, and then boom, there's all over dopamine and you feel great. So I would want to know, can one become, or can one experience limerence if they are being manipulated or emotionally abused? Is there a possibility? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. So I often talk about limerence from the perspective of the neuroscience, that we have this built into us, and it's an instability, if you like, within the reward system that clearly not everybody has. And whether or not you have that instability, and whether or not it would be triggered by trying to bond to another person and manifest as limerence, is going to depend on everything that's happened in your life, from birth through the development of your brain into all your formative romantic experiences and the expectations that you have about what love should feel like, and the kinds of people that you would become limerent for. But the second layer of it is that it obviously also will depend on the behavior of the other person. So if you do become limerent for a limerent object who is manipulative or inconsistent, or for whatever the cause, if they generate uncertainty in you about the strength of the bond, that's one of the most powerful reinforcing mechanisms for driving desire for a reward into addiction. So the dopamine system, again, the sort of the details and the nuance of it are really fascinating. What the dopamine system is really trying to do is help you learn how to secure rewards in a predictable way. And if you succeed in learning about how to get a predictable reward, the power of that reward will decrease. So you'll have a process, in terms of physiology, called habituation, where the system adapts, and you kind of get calm again. So an example I give in my book is, people that own an orchard don't have a craving for apples. You can always secure the reward in a predictable way, so that you if I behave like this, I will get this reward. Now, when you have an intermittent reward that is unpredictable, that is random, the reward system, the dopamine system, can't habituate, because you can't learn. There isn't a predictable way to say, oh, when I do this, I get, a good interaction with my limerent object, but when I do that, they're unhappy. So kind of in a healthy relationship, you would start to learn things like, if I give a gift, they seem happy, and sometimes I get a gift back. And I'm not saying that this is sort of conscious calculation or transaction, but you just get reciprocity, so that you learn, when I express my feelings of affection and love, I get that back. And so you adapt, and you learn, okay, this is stable, this is predictable, this is secure. But if you're trying to bond with somebody that's giving you mixed messages or deliberately manipulating you, then you can never adapt. You'll never habituate. So it's much more likely that you will get driven into that state of addiction, of relentless wanting. And again, this comes back to the point where that can last even past the point that you realize, I just feel terrible with this person. I don't like this person. They're not a nice person. I don't really want to be with them, but I can't give them up. I'm just drawn, like I'm tethered. I just keep wanting to make it work, to somehow break through all of those problems and get a secure bond. But it isn't possible with somebody who is being manipulative or who is narcissistic. So they want, your adoration of them to give them narcissistic supply. So they'll do whatever it takes to make sure that you are stuck on them, and you're still giving them attention and giving them affection. And they will often learn how to manipulate your emotions in order to keep you in that state of uncertainty, so that you can't ever relax. And that is more likely to drive you into a state of addiction.
Tom, you said that not a lot of people, experience limerence. I mean, a couple of minutes back, you said a huge chunk, a huge, group of people experience that. I would want to know, Tom, is there a similarity between limerence and trauma bonding? And if it is not similar, what is the difference? Because me as a therapist, to me, it looks very similar. It looks like, twin brother and sister, twin siblings, with different, technical terminology and, terms, and different, highs and lows. But it looks very similar. What are your thoughts, Tom? Is it like similar, or is it different? Then how different it is?
So I'm not an expert on the neuroscience of trauma bonding. I'll start with that.
Mm-hmm.
So at the mechanistic level, I couldn't say for sure, what's the driving force behind a trauma bond compared to limerence. I think the likeliest difference is that limerence starts in, if you like, a positive drive. So it starts as being, enjoyable, exciting, fun, promising, romantic, and that sort of potential. So limerence normally begins in that phase of exhilaration and connection that then can go wrong. And if it's frustrated, so that you're not able to resolve the limerence, either by forming a relationship or by getting a very clear no from your limerent object. So again, if the limerent object just kind of comes out and says, "Oh, I'm just not interested in you romantically. I'm sorry, you're a wonderful person, whatever," and it's a very simple no, then the limerence can kind of get resolved because there's no hope left. So you can't sort of sustain the fantasy of, or maybe I would be able to connect as a consequence of that. So if it's very clear one way or the other that a relationship is or isn't possible, then the limerence doesn't get into that kind of addictive phase. It really only ends up going into that addictive phase that feels, like you are unable to stop your behavior, and you're getting the intrusive thoughts, and you're getting the craving, and you're getting that emotional exhaustion of being hooked on somebody that you can't get a resolution from. So I think limerence usually starts kind of in a positive romantic phase and then transitions into that kind of addictive phase. I don't know for trauma bonding what would be the neuroscience at the initiating point on that. How does a trauma bond generally begin, would you say?
I personally feel, as per my experience and the things that I am exposed to, I personally feel, there is this inconsistency, of, the kind of treatment, that is, thrown at you. I mean, controlling love, and then withholding it and then releasing it, in bits and pieces and not, completely. You also, said that there is a very good phase initially, when, you develop this limerence. I mean, in our domain, we call it love bombing phase, when everything is rosy, great, and you keep chasing it, but it doesn't materialize. You are just chasing it, and that's it. I mean, it doesn't give you stability. I personally feel love gives you stability. Healthy love gives you stability. You are grounded. You get strengthened at the core. But I personally feel trauma bonding, or if you say limerence, it doesn't let you stabilize. It just lets you keep chasing it. You want it to, in some ways, I would say, materialize or reach fruition, but that day never comes. You are in that constant chase. So I mean, from my perspective, I personally feel trauma bonding is quite similar. I mean, I'm just chasing, but I'm never getting. I'm just getting the crumbs, and I'm dreaming for the entire loaf of bread, but that bread is not making its way to me. So I personally feel the chemical aspect of trauma bonding is again intermittent, reinforcement, intermittent love, withholding love and affection, and then slowly releasing it, only in a conditional manner and in a very transactional way. If you do this, I'm going to release some bit of love, but if you don't, you'll be you have to bear with silent treatment, passive aggressive things. And I think all of it really alters our chemical state in the head. I mean, limerence, I mean, you have beautifully explained, and the kind of research you have done, and you're still exploring. I personally feel there is this huge similarity between trauma bonding, limerence, and also the Stockholm syndrome. Whereas in you can't think beyond that person. And also, one more thing I would like to highlight over here, Tom, is that in my practice, I have seen that some people, I don't know how you would view this, but they need options. I mean, let's put it in the terms of, limerence and that domain. They are ready to change the limerent object, but only if they are given a better option. They can then, get fixated to this new subject, this new individual, and then start building and weaving and start, living in that fantasy. And one day we're gonna do this happy ending and all of those things. But again, they're
Yeah,
just chasing. And now, Tom, I would also like to know, how do you see love, genuine love, from this
sure.
obsessive pull of limerence, or I mean, I call it trauma bonding. I mean, what is the difference between a
Mm,
genuine love, according to you? And please tell us, the chemical aspect also, the highs and lows, and what happens over
yeah,
here. So, I mean, Tom,
sure.
please tell us.
So, I mean, there's so many interesting ideas there, Sarah. so, um, going back to the trauma bonding,
Uh-huh.
just briefly. So,
Uh-huh.
what I would say is about half the population experience limerence when you define limerence as being that state of an altered state of mind of very profound romantic infatuation for another person. But only probably about half of the people that experience limerence in their life end up having it as a distressing psychological burden. So these numbers are from a survey that I ran where I just sampled from 1,500 adults in the US and the UK and asked them, essentially gave a definition of limerence and said, have you ever experienced this? And a little over half of the people said yes. And then I said, has this ever caused you so much psychological distress that it affected your quality of life? And half of the people again said yes. So a difficulty with all of this is about definitions and about exactly what you mean when you say limerence and exactly what you mean when you say trauma bonding and exactly what you mean when you say love. So I would say people can get into that altered state of mind, and that has this sort of defining set of symptoms. Sometimes it works out fine and it resolves in a healthy way. And for example, if there's a clear no or a clear yes from the limerent object, and then those people are able to form a secure bond. So then I wouldn't say that limerence is a problem in life at all. Limerence is a problem when something frustrates that, and then you end up in that state of person addiction where you feel trapped because the uncertainty has gone on for so long that you end up getting into that addictive state. There are lots of ways that that can go wrong. So what you're describing in terms of trauma bonding is a very clear example of how what I would call limerence could go wrong and get driven into that person addiction state. That set of circumstances would mean that somebody ended up in a state of limerence, in a state of person addiction. I hear from other people who, like you said about they're almost waiting for a better limerent object to come along, that they'll end up getting almost addicted to the fantasy, that they will become limerent for one person and then they'll stay in a state of fantasy, but they don't take action. So kind of through the uncertainty is coming partly through their indecision and their hesitation in wanting to declare their feelings. And there can be lots of reasons for why, but they almost get trapped in being addicted to the fantasy. And they will then go through a series of limerent objects, through their life, who are literally the projection for their fantasy, for their kind of sense of longing. And there can be other cases, where it's more simple in terms of just bad luck. Let's say you become limerent for a co-worker and you're both married, and so nobody can take any action, but you can't avoid that person. You still need to interact with them because you're in the workplace together. And so it becomes very difficult to sort of withdraw from the sort of addictive stimulus, but you also can't take action because you have that sense of obligation. But people will then get obviously into a state where it's just the uncertainty can be, well, in theory, although I'm committed, I could change partner. It's not impossible. I could get divorced. There could be some breakup and then it could happen. So there's still that hope and uncertainty together that can end up, driving you into that sort of state of person addiction. So yes, definitely trauma bonding is a very powerful way of pushing you from the excitement of early limerence into the exhaustion of person addiction. And like you say, there can be people that do that very deliberately, that they are strategic in their manipulation, in giving you crumbs and then withholding, and then giving you crumbs and then withholding, and not doing it in a predictable way. And that would lead to that bond that feels very hard to break, even though it's founded on unpleasant behavior that has pushed you into that state. So how I see all of this from being different from love is love. I mean, there's lots of ways that you can describe love, and that the ancient Greeks had kind of 7 or 8 different forms of love. For me, classic love is mutual affection, mutual attraction, mutual care, the desire to be with that person just because you enjoy being with that person, and their company makes you feel good and your company makes them feel good, and you feel a tight bond, a tight affinity and attachment and care for them. And the sort of external things, like you would do anything for them, you would put your life in jeopardy to save their life, that those sorts of drives of a kind of healthy, secure pair bond. That is really, at a neurochemical level, mostly about oxytocin and vasopressin, and about the kind of attachment system. So that simply cannot develop in the early phases of a relationship. You can't early on fall into a deep attachment that's based on mutual care, reciprocation of feeling, and a kind of a slow build of affinity that comes through shared experience and through mutual love. That has to come at a later stage, as you have those experiences and build those memories and build that time together. So limerence might be the prelude to then falling into a long-term healthy bond. And again, using myself as a case study, that's exactly what happened with my wife, that I was limerent for her when we met, and it was wonderful and it was ecstatic. And as it turned out, she was limerent for me as well. So we got that ecstatic union of mutual limerence. That was, wonderful and exciting and so on. But we then did go into a phase where that limerence and that exhilaration and the tingles and the fireworks faded away, because our reward systems had adapted and habituated to the fact that, yes, this is a good reward, but it's been secured and it's predictable and you're bonded now, and that's all good. And that, at that point, I think many limerents do hit a bit of a rough patch in a relationship, because they think, oh, my limerent exhilaration is gone. What does that mean in terms of love? And I would say it doesn't mean anything other than the fact that you're now transitioning into a different form of love, a different state of love. So you're no longer in that altered state of mind. You now got your right mind back, if you like. And then you sort of see whether or not you're compatible enough to sort of go into a long-term, affectional bonding form of love. Now, one of the biggest mistakes that limerents make is thinking that the strength of their limerence predict how good the ultimate relationship will be. And in actual fact, there can be almost no correlation at all. People can have, for reasons in their past and the life experience that they've had, they can have a tendency to become limerent for people who won't form a secure, healthy bond. So, if you have had childhood trauma, bonding problems, attachment problems in your history, it can be more likely that you become limerent for people who behave in a way that makes them unpredictable and makes them that they are it's some subconscious program that's settled in, that people that behave in this way, that they're unpredictable or they're withholding or they're rude or they're sarcastic or something like that, can trigger that sense of desire that leads to the onset of limerence. And unfortunately for people who are having that experience, limerence is kind of a warning sign, because if you tend to become limerent and feel that glimmer of limerence excitement over people that treat you badly or who you can see treat other people badly, you'll end up repeatedly becoming limerent for people that you can't form a secure bond with. And so your relationships will end up hitting, the buffers at that point where it becomes clear you're just not compatible. There's just not going to be a long-term relationship out of this. So limerence, whether or not limerence leads ultimately to healthy long-term love, depends on what it is that triggers limerence in you.
Wow, beautifully explained. Tom, I have worked with a lot of survivors, of various forms of abuse, and I have helped them, recover and, move on in life. But one common thing that I have heard and I have observed and I have witnessed, me being a survivor myself, I have witnessed that, in every, victim's life or survivor's life, there is, this core, and it's almost like these three things that keeps them glued to their abuser or to the toxic person XYZ, and those three things are fear. I mean, I call it fog. Fear of rejection and abandonment, that is there. The second thing is obligation, the belief that you owe loyalty at any cost to that person, I mean, to your limerent object or to whom you are trauma bonded, however we look at it. And the other one is G, that is guilt, that paralyzing sense of being selfish for wanting freedom or for distancing myself from that person, that object. So Tom, do you think these things are present when we look at limerent state and that dynamic, that state? Do you think these things exist there also in that domain?
Yes, they certainly can, and that can be kind of compound the problem of person addiction, if that you're feeling that those other reasons why you've got a duty to stay with this other person. And again, whatever it is in your background that has led you to believe that you are obligated to always give of yourself, always be understanding, always accommodate their needs, that is going to definitely keep you trapped, particularly if it's a person that wants you trapped, that wants you tethered to them through whatever mechanism. But limerence and is going to be a powerful one, that if you've ended up in that state of person addiction and they are then playing on your sense of duty and making you feel guilty in a manipulative way, then that's going to be even harder to break out of that. So if you've kind of have this sense of, well, the history of the limerence with this person was that I felt fantastic, and then I felt, a relentless want, a relentless desire, and then the whole I've invested so much, and it felt like I was so close to getting what I wanted, but I just haven't quite cracked the code yet of how I get what I want. And of course, that's a trap, because you never will. You'll never get closure. You'll never get satisfaction, because particularly if the other person is never going to give it, because that's how they manipulate you. That's how they play on your feelings. That will also reinforce it. So if you think about somebody in that state, they will think, well, I did at one time love this person because I had all those amazing feelings and I got all that euphoria and I got all those highs and those fantasies, and I wanted them for so long and I've invested so much that now I can't do without them. Because that's the other awful thing about addiction, states of addiction, is you almost have to carry out the behaviors just to feel normal. That if you don't follow the addiction, then you feel terrible. You feel you get withdrawal pains, and so addicts often get into that trap of taking a drink, taking the drugs, going to the casino in order to just moderate their mood or regulate their mood, because they feel so bad that this is the one thing that gives them fleeting relief from those negative feelings. So you're going to have all of that jumbled together, keeping you trapped in kind of a relationship that really isn't in any objective way serving your needs or doing anything positive for you.
Mm-hmm. Tom, you had been researching this topic for quite some time. I would want to know, have you come across any research or have you observed something? Is there any, age, criteria there? Only this age to this age will experience and that's it, and not this age and that age. I mean, if you could tell us, I mean, are there any, evidences or...
It's across the lifespan. So, I hear from people in their teens, and I hear from people in their 80s, who are having a new limerence experience at 85. So I think it is across the lifespan, because these are sort of fundamental built-in neural systems, and they can be activated at any time. So even after you're no longer fertile, no longer able to have children, unfortunately these drives are still there, because they're not intelligently engineered, so that they will fade away after you're no longer able to reproduce. We're not built like that. We just have the drives built in, and they keep going. So the one kind of slight qualification that I would make is there does seem to be a peak in midlife. So I think there's a sort of a phase, whether it's just a coincidence because people tend to get into a period of self-reflection and start to examine their lives and their choices, and whether they want to, live the rest of their life in the same way that they've started the first half of their life. Whether it's just a coincidence about that it's just a stage of life where people are, reevaluating their choices, or whether it is actually, if you like, a last gasp. This is your last chance, to have a relationship that might result in children and might result in babies. Whether there is a kind of a hormonal or biological push at that point, I don't think has really been settled. But it does seem to be fairly common that there's a spike in limerence at midlife.
Mm-hmm. And Tom, are we more limerent at some stage and some point? I mean, you have said, there is a peak, but I would want to know, is there something, when you are very limerent? I mean, for example, I personally feel we are very porous when we are experiencing a traumatic event. I mean, psychologically, we are really porous when we are high on maybe substance or alcohol. It increases our porosity. If we, view things, based on the IFS model, and that makes us very, permeable. That makes us very porous, and I mean, that's again a different, topic. I would want to know: is there any peak points, not just one peak phase? Or is there something, that is related to the hormone, to your growth, I mean, to the way how you are processing things, that you reach that peak and then again it fizzes out? Or, it's something that is stable and consistent?
So most limerence report it starting in adolescence. And limerence, when you describe the symptoms of it to people that don't experience limerence, often they will say something like, well, that's just a crush. I had a crush on a celebrity or a footballer or something like that when I was a teenager, and what you're describing is just a crush. And so, it could be, you could look at limerence as being, well, it begins in that adolescence phase. And then for some people, as their brains develop, maybe their executive brain, their prefrontal cortex is just naturally better at regulating desire, regulating rewards, and providing a more kind of powerful feedback. And so they get over that tendency to have a crush as they mature, like in terms of like the physical maturation of the brain, not just our own personal psychological maturation. And so it could be at that level that people can grow out of a crush, and so don't experience those same symptoms as an adult, whereas the other half of us still have that instability built in. And so, it may be the case that it is partly hardwired into the way that our brains develop in the later stages of adolescence and early adulthood, because the brain is, particularly the prefrontal cortex, is into your mid-20s that you're still getting development and particularly myelination. And so that may be a factor, but also life experience, definitely. So periods of stress, periods of grieving, periods of trauma, periods of change can trigger limerence in people. I mean, again, I don't have good data on this, but anecdotally, I hear from hundreds, thousands of limerence through the site, and many people talk about, losing their mother to cancer and then developing wild limerence, or going through a stressful divorce, or getting made redundant at work. So these kinds of life-changing events can be a trigger for a limerence episode. And that might be to do with hormones, it might be to do with stress and things like that. But just as equally, it may be that limerence typically learn that they can use limerent fantasy for mood repair. So if they're feeling anxious, they've learned subconsciously that having a romantic fantasy in mind is a way of having a limerent object, is a way of getting natural reward, making you feel high, making you feel better. So if you like, the subconscious is just calculating, I want to get out of this state of distress. And I know that fantasizing about a limerent object is a way to feel good. It's a way to, moderate the mood. So it may be about that, sort of not directly physiological, but as much learned behavior, that limerence can be used to make you feel good at times when life is putting you through it.
Mm-hmm. Are you saying that limerent, I mean, the individuals who are experiencing limerence, they use, this superpower to soothe, numb, cope, and regulate themselves? Are you saying that?
Yeah. So I think a lot of people, and this can even be that trap of where you don't take action on kind of romantic connection, romantic desire, because whilst it's still in your head as a fantasy, you can tap into it anytime that you want, and you can get that kind of second-hand excitement of imagining what it would be like to be with them, and that makes you feel high, and it's risk-free. because it's all, safely in your mind and in your imagination, and people can end up actually realizing that they've trapped themselves in that state of longing. Actually, I'm reading a book just at the moment. It's not out yet, but it's by Amanda McCracken, which
Uh-huh.
is all about how she almost became addicted to longing, and longing came to almost define her love life. And I think, that limerence can often relate to that sense, because they've always got a limerent object who's a fantasy figure in their mind, even if they're not taking action to try and form a relationship with them.
Mhm.
So yes, limerence is very effective for mood regulation, but it does keep you trapped in life.
True. Tom, culturally, I have seen limerence is often brushed off as just, infatuation, a kind of a passing crush. But I mean, after going through your work, Dorothy's work, I personally feel it can become, a kind of a destructive cycle that, influences and shapes our choices, relationship, and even, it has the ability to affect our self-worth also. I would want to know, Tom, what are some of the long-term mental health consequences that you have observed or noted if, the state, limerence, goes unaddressed?
So, I think it's the immediate consequences are the distress caused by that state of addiction, where you can't get comfort, you can't get relief. You have the intrusive thoughts about the other person that make it impossible to concentrate on the things that you're doing. And anxiety, a state of anxiety. And it's sad because we just follow our instincts into that state. And then it's very difficult to reverse your way out of that state once it's set in. And so, there's the immediate emotional challenge of managing that state of personal addiction with all the negative effects, so these cravings and intrusive thoughts, impulsive behavior. Then there's the kind of second layer, which is if you have got commitment to other people or other responsibilities in life, you can start neglecting those and feeling guilty. And again, if you're somebody who's in a relationship, in a long-term relationship, but you develop limerence for somebody outside that, there's going to be an enormous amount of guilt associated with that. And you're going to have to wrestle with the fact that, well, I'm feeling all of this exhilarating infatuation for one person, and yet I'm in a long-term, stable, happy relationship with somebody else that isn't exciting. And so it doesn't feel like magical, like, limerence can, but is stable and secure and committed. And people wrestle with the cognitive dissonance of that. What does it mean? And an awful lot of what I write about is trying to help people make sense of that state. It actually doesn't mean anything other than you've followed your instincts into this mental state of limerence, this state of potentially as far as person addiction. And there are ways out of it, but that's got absolutely no bearing on any kind of existing relationships that you've got. It's really just about you learning how to, if you like, deprogram yourself out of that altered mental state. But there's that sort of second layer of, social pain in terms of feeling guilty, feeling ashamed, feeling embarrassed, keeping secrets, and then feeling bad about the fact that you're keeping secrets. So all of that, complicated state of things. And then probably the highest level of it is people who realize that they've, essentially fantasized their adult life away, chasing after, bouts of limerence for people that weren't interested in them, but they've not wanted to give up on hope, and they've ended up in what I sometimes call limerence limbo, where they spend months or years stuck on somebody, and unable to sort of free themselves from that. And that they then do come to realize, gosh, I wasted some of the prime years of my life on fantasies and daydreams rather than actually forming meaningful relationships. And again, that's a lot to deal with if you get to that realization, and maybe that is another reason why at midlife there is a bit of a crisis of identity and a crisis of what kind of decisions you've made and what kind of life you've lived up to that point. So yeah, there's multiple layers. There's kind of direct internal emotional pain. There's the social thing of relating to other people, and then there's the sort of, if you like, the highest level thing of how have I used my life? Have I done well?
True. Tom, much of my work centers around regulation. I mean, helping the clients, quiet their nervous system and break free from their, spirals, obsessive thought loops. But, I have seen survivors often feel very powerless, in the face of what we call limerence. They're just helpless. I can't do it, Sarah. I can't. I feel obligated. I can't. How will people see me? People will call me cruel. People will call me this and that. They have their own reasons. Tom, I would want to know what practical brain-based strategies would you recommend to interrupt this cycle, that they are trapped in, and, restore somewhat a kind of, emotional balance. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so as you kind of, put it, the mindset is probably the first step. That if you do feel I have an obligation, I must look after this person, I must not commit, I must not free myself, for all of those reasons, I think you first do need to get to the stage of understanding what caused those feelings to develop in you. And that sounds like the work that you do in terms of helping people to kind of come to consciousness, if you like, of why they feel obligated and committed to this person that's not treating them well. In terms of limerence, the way I make sense of it and the way I explain it, so both in my book, I also have an online course that goes through this process of kind of deprogramming the limerent brain. You've accidentally trained yourself over time into this state of personal addiction just by following your instincts, in a completely natural way. You end up training your brain into this state of limerence. That means it's perfectly possible to train yourself out of that state, because you essentially need to reverse the behaviors and the habits and the beliefs that have pushed you into that mental state. So I look at it as being the sort of 3 stages to recovery. So the first stage is to recognize that your limerent object is essentially a drug. You're addicted to them. And so you need to limit contact with them as much as you possibly can. So where you have whatever power you have to limit your contact with your limerent object, take it. You're weaning yourself off this drug. And an essential part of that is to, at least in the short term, you can think about whether or not you reconnect with that person at some point in the future when you're fully well. That's a discussion for another time. But in the short term, when you're trying to deprogram, you want to get distance from your limerent object. And that's not just about in-person contact. That's also, texting, WhatsApp, social media, and all of the kind of passive exposure that you can get by, looking on their Facebook page or on their Instagram, things like that. So that's step 1. The second thing is that you need to exercise your executive brain. So that sense of feeling powerless, that's coming from the fact that your executive brain that should be moderating and reducing that desire is weakened, it's desensitized. So you want to train it and strengthen it almost like a muscle again to reverse that weakening process, that desensitization process. So things like training yourself to notice when you're having a limerent thought or when you're having a limerent feeling. So even noticing, oh, that was a limerent urge. So when you're, trying to concentrate on, I don't know, writing or doing some work, and just a thought breaks in, I wonder what they're doing now. I wonder where they are. I wonder what's happening. Recognize, oh, that was a limerent thought. And even just recognizing it is waking up your executive brain, if you like, to that different way of looking at it and seeing it. Oh, that was an impulse that was being sent up by my dopamine system. And then try to exercise more and more self-control of, I'm not going to act on it. I've had that impulse, I've had that thought, but I don't actually have to go and find out what they're doing. I can choose, not to. And that takes time because the training can be quite ingrained and it does take time to do it. But you can also help in more general terms just by kind of exercising self-control at other times in your life. So, we all know what we should be doing to live a more healthy life. So, more exercise, better sleep, better diet, things like this. They're actually keystone habits that if you can kind of work on developing more self-discipline, work on, improving your sleep cycles or improving your diet or something like that, you get spillover benefits. And so just by kind of exercising that executive control, you can start to feel much more in charge of the situation, as though it's within your power to change things, which it is. And then the third stage of it is to break the association between your limerent object and reward. So that is the fundamental heart of the problem. They were a massive natural high, a massively powerful natural reward. So you want to try and break that association between them and reward. And there's, a few different ways that you can do that. Probably two of the most powerful are, if you think about times when you've had daydreams or fantasies about your limerent object, and again, often limerents will revisit those favorite fantasies and those favorite daydreams in order to kind of regulate their mood. You need to spoil them. So you need to change the script, work your way through the fantasy, and then ruin the ending. So have it, instead of going off into the sunset with your limerent object, they say, stop the car, I have to get out. This is a terrible mistake. I don't know what I was doing. I never want to see you again. So you stop that instinctive impulse to go and have the calming fantasy, the reassuring fantasy, by deliberately spoiling it so that it isn't rewarding anymore. And then the second thing is what I call anchor memories. So we tend to have very powerful memories of good times that we've had with our limerent object. And we will often revisit those anchor memories to try and calm ourselves again, to get some relief from the pain. But we all generally also have very negative memories where we had a terrible time, when we felt humiliated or embarrassed, or they said something awful to us, and we felt terrible. So again, what you want to do is, anytime you feel the urge to start reliving that positive anchor memory, switch it to the negative anchor memory and think in terms of, that is the emotional reality of this relationship for me. Those awful experiences define the reality of what staying trapped with this person will mean for me. And the people that you're generally talking about, I think the people that you generally talk to in therapy will feel bad about that. they will feel like, oh no, that's not fair. There was a reason why they were behaving badly at that time.
Backstory, yeah.
It doesn't matter. You don't have to believe the truth of it. What you're doing is reversing the idealization. So the belief that they were this, embodiment of romantic perfection is completely false. That's a limerent idealization fantasy. Well, all you're doing now is reversing it and telling your subconscious the opposite story of, no, actually, it wasn't ideal, it wasn't perfect. They actually made me feel really bad. So you kind of want to break that impulse to idealize them. So those are techniques for how to get your brain out of that altered state. The last thing I would say that is very important is all of that process is quite demoralizing and quite punishing. You're spoiling your rewards. You're, dwelling on negative experiences and things like that. That will demoralize you if you don't complement it with having a positive vision of the future. So it's very important at the same time to also have an idea of how you want your life to be, what things that you could do to change your life to make it more purposeful, more meaningful, more, healthy rewards that you could pursue, so that you're in the mindset of, I am coming out of this period of limerence. It was an important stage in my life. I learned a lot about myself. I learned a lot about my beliefs. I learned a lot about, how my past has affected my romantic tendencies. But now I am transitioning into a new future, a better future where I'm more in control of my life, and I'm pursuing things that matter to me and that are positive. And not from a selfish perspective, but just from a sense of, I want to do something meaningful. It could be something charitable. It could be, a new job. It could be a new project, that you're pursuing, or a hobby, or and many people find meaning and purpose from helping others. So if you do have that tendency, there are healthy ways that you can, play that out. And have a benefit that doesn't mean you sacrificing your time and your energy to somebody who is abusive or toxic. So that's the overall picture. Kind of get that mindset right about where you are now in this state of addiction, where you want to be, and what your purposeful vision for your life in the future is going to be, and then step by step using those sort of psychological techniques to get yourself from there to there.
Tom, before I conclude today's session, I have got a situation that I want you to observe through the lens of limerence. I have been working with a lot of survivors and victims of narcissistic abuse, toxic relationship, and family. I have seen the toxic individual, or let's say the narcissist, they are into future faking. They sell you a dream, but that dream never reaches fruition. And they hoover when they see that they are losing control, or their supply sources trying to run away, or they might lose their supply source. They tend to hoover. They tend to bait them back into the relationship. And I have observed with the victims also that they come up with their own theories. Victims who are trauma bonded and enmeshed in an unhealthy way with their abuser, the narcissist, they come up with their own theories. They had difficult backstory. Now when they don't get attention from their narcissist, their abuser, they tend to hoover and ghost their abuser as well. Or when they are getting over with that relationship, that hoovering is something that I've observed. Hoovering, baiting, ghosting. I've seen the narcissists do the same thing, and I have seen the victims also do the same thing. And in a way, I have seen them both being addicted to each other. Now what I want to know, Tom, is is limerence at play when we look at the narcissist? And is limerence at play when we look at the victims, or it is just with the victims? And my next question is, do limerents who are experiencing limerence, do they ever discard their limerent object?
I could see that limerence would be in play for the victim, in the sense that if that's what feels right for them, like if that feels emotionally, it's very difficult to express the idea. If they feel emotionally safe with circling back to the narcissist to try, like, maybe one last time, I'll give them a chance to prove that they can form this relationship. If that's what feels normal to them, it kind of is bizarrely rational in a kind of irrational way for an outside observer. And certainly in limerence, one of the biggest challenges in recovery is the false dawn, the feeling like, oh, I'm feeling better now, I feel safe, I just need to reach out to my limerent object and get closure. We'll just have a mature conversation about it, and I'll, know for sure that there's definitely no future. So you sort of start to feel better and forget the worst of the lows of the person addiction, and then reach out again. So it's kind of almost a relapse that you're trying to re-engage and see if you can kind of make it work properly this time. So that's definitely a danger. One way of kind of moderating that danger is, if you can't stop yourself, relapses are inevitable. They're going to happen. And so it's how you respond when you have a relapse that really determines if you escape in the long haul, or if you just end up, cycling back. And I think if you can go through a relapse, have a negative experience again with the limerent object, and then reintegrate that as an anchor memory and think, I knew it would be well, I knew it wouldn't work. And now I've got the proof. Okay, I tried again. I've got the proof. I don't need to try for a third time. And again, this is why limiting contact is so important, because if you do manage to do that effectively, there's no chance for hoovering, because you've sort of set a boundary of, I will not use social media, I will not, text them or, reach out again. But this is why relapses happen, is because it's very difficult to resist the limerent craving, the addictive craving, when it's too strong. In terms of narcissists being limerents, I mean, I couldn't rule it out, because so many people are limerents. But it seems contrary to narcissism. It seems as though it would be something that they hate, because they would be dependent on another person, so they would feel powerless themselves, that the emotions are overtaking them and they're not in control of the relationship. So I don't know how a narcissist would react if they became limerent for somebody else. So yeah, that's an interesting question. I guess it's about getting into the psychology of a narcissist, which is not hugely appealing.
Because Tom, I have seen victims having this strong urge of not leaving, their narcissist with whom they are trauma bonded. And I have seen even narcissists hating, the idea of losing their supply. I have seen them, future faking and shape shifting also. I have become good. I'm in therapy. Don't worry. I'm a perfect person.
Yeah.
I'm working on myself.
I'm working on myself.
And again, and then again, the cycle repeats itself. So, I mean, this is my, personal observation, that narcissists do, experience limerence only towards their supply source. I mean, if that makes sense, something from whom they're getting something in return, and not everyone.
Yeah.
So maybe they are limerent towards their limerent object, that is the victim. And these victims who are starving, for them, their supply source or whatsoever, the crumb source or however you put it, is the narcissist. So I think limerence is at play in both the fronts. I don't know how you view this.
Yeah, I mean, I can totally believe that the narcissists get a high from the supply. That they essentially are chasing their own natural drug of, their magnificence being reflected back from somebody else who is completely infatuated, completely besotted, completely hooked on them. Whether I would call that limerence, I'm not sure. I think that's a reward coming from a different motive, a different stimulus. So I could completely accept that narcissists are doing the same thing as limerence, in the sense that they're chasing a natural high, but they're getting their natural high from their ability to seduce the other person and get the other person hooked, rather than a desire to form a pair bond, because that's the kind of fundamental drive behind limerence, is that desire to form a pair bond with another person that seems so amazingly attractive to you.
Are you saying that limerence only exists, where there is a possibility of, forming a close, intimate bond?
That's really the driving force for limerence. I mean, many people do get in touch and say that they feel they've had platonic limerence. So limerence for a mentor, or limerence for somebody, a different sexual orientation or something like that. I mean, sometimes that does provoke a kind of reflection on their own sexuality, and they do start to ask questions about, well, maybe I'm bisexual, and this is just the first time that I felt attracted to a same-sex partner. But sometimes there's no real sexual desire there. And also I hear from people that are generally asexual and don't really feel sexual desire, don't have, a powerful libido, but do experience limerence, do want to bond and form a close pair bond, a close partnership with another person. So they do find that person incredibly attractive, but erotic desire isn't part of the experience for them. So again, this kind of comes down to definitions. When is it limerence versus when is it other phenomena that feel good and make you feel high, and other drives. Usually limerence has a sexual element to it. So most limerence do feel part of the reward of the other person is erotic, and desire to mate with that other person, you can see then why, from an evolutionary perspective, it would increase the odds of reproduction.
Oh, wonderful. So thank you so much, Tom. I mean, it was a wonderful podcast, wonderful session. I have, still a lot of unanswered questions. So definitely I'm going to request you to come back again, because it's amazing, to go down this lane. I mean, it's almost like a rabbit hole, limerence for me. I'm like so fixated in understanding and knowing everything. I mean, it's really amazing. And thank you so much, Tom, for joining us today. I'm looking forward to have you again. And guys, you can check Tom's channel. I'm going to mention in the description. Lots of informative content is there. And you can check out his books on Amazon. It's amazing. So thank you so much, Tom, for joining today.
Thank you very much, Sarah. It was a pleasure.